It was 2 in the morning when the mafia boss walked into his own hallway and saw something that stopped him cold. A pregnant maid was cleaning the shelves. She reached up, and her sleeve slid down. Dark bruises wrapped around her wrist, the kind that come from fingers. He almost looked away, but then he saw her face, a small scar above her left eyebrow. He knew that scar. He'd been standing 3 feet away the day she got it, when they were 9 years old. She was his childhood friend, the one who disappeared 17 years ago, and she had no idea he recognized her. The house was quiet at 2:30 in the morning. Callum Brennan stood in the foyer of his estate, rolling his neck, loosening the tension that had settled into his shoulders over the course of a 14-hour day. The marble floors reflected the dim amber glow of the sconces along the hallway. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock ticked. The sound of water running through old pipes hummed faintly behind the walls. Outside, the October wind moved through the hedgerows with a low, steady murmur that pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. He dropped his keys on the entryway table and moved through the corridor toward the kitchen. He wasn't hungry. He just needed the silence of the house to press against him for a few minutes before sleep. His days were long and relentless. Meetings that were never called meetings, conversations in parked cars and back offices, the constant, exhausting work of holding together an organization that demanded precision and vigilance at every hour. That's when he saw her. A woman in a plain red uniform moved through the far end of the hallway, carrying a caddy of cleaning supplies. She was slight, her dark hair pulled back in a low knot. Even from 20 feet away, he could see the exhaustion in the slope of her shoulders. She moved carefully, like someone managing pain she didn't want anyone to notice. Her shoes were worn at the heels. The uniform hung loosely on her frame, except at her midsection, where the fabric pulled tight. She didn't see him. She reached up to wipe the top of a hallway shelf, and her sleeve slid down her forearm. Callum stopped walking. There were bruises around her wrist, not faint ones. Dark, deliberate marks, the kind that come from fingers closing too hard, too many times. The pattern was unmistakable, 5 points of pressure, fading from purple to a sickly yellow at the edges. He stared. Something about her profile caught in the low light, the angle of her jaw, the way she tucked her chin when she concentrated. The small scar above her left eyebrow. He knew that scar. He had been standing 3 feet away the day she got it, when she was 9 years old and fell off the chain-link fence behind the laundromat on Hester Street. He had watched the blood run down her face and into her eye, and she had wiped it away with the back of her hand and told him she was fine. She was fine. Oh. Stop looking at her like that. His chest went cold. She turned slightly, and for one fraction of a second, their eyes met. She looked away immediately, picked up the caddy, moved toward the service hallway as if she hadn't seen him at all. Her footsteps were quick and deliberate. The walk of someone who had learned that being noticed was never safe. But Callum Brennan did not move. He stood perfectly still in the corridor of his own home, watching the ghost of a girl he hadn't seen in 17 years disappear around the corner. Nola Ferris. The name surfaced in his mind like something pulled from deep water. Nola. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, turning his phone over in his hands, staring at the wall. The image of those bruises wouldn't leave him. The way she had looked, hollowed out, worn down to something barely holding together, and pregnant. She had been visibly pregnant, her belly pressing against the uniform in a way that made the fabric pull tight at the seams. How far along he couldn't tell. 6 months, 7. Enough that working a night shift on her feet, carrying supplies, reaching and bending and scrubbing was a cruelty in itself. Callum had not built what he built by being sentimental. He had come up from Hester Street with nothing. No father, a mother who worked double shifts at the fish packing plant until her hands cracked and bled. He had fought his way through every rung. The streets, the crews, the power struggles, the quiet wars of attrition that nobody outside the life ever saw, until his name carried weight that no one in 3 boroughs questioned. He had learned early that emotion was a vulnerability and that showing it could cost you everything. But the girl on Hester Street had been there before any of that. Before the money, before the fear, before the empire. Before anyone in the world treated Callum Brennan like he mattered, Nola Ferris had. By 6 in the morning he was downstairs. The house was beginning to stir. Kitchen staff arriving through the service entrance. The low clatter of breakfast preparation beginning behind closed doors. He found Mrs. Tierney, the head of household staff, in the service kitchen reviewing schedules on a clipboard. She was a compact, efficient woman in her 60s who had run his household for nearly a decade and who treated every operational question with the gravity of a military briefing. "The woman who was cleaning the east hallway last night," he said. "Late shift, dark hair, pregnant, Mrs. Tierney." Looked up. "That would be Nola. She's been on the overnight crew for about 3 weeks." 3 weeks? She came through the agency. Good worker, quiet, doesn't complain, keeps her head down. Honestly, she's one of the better ones we've had. Who assigned her to overnights? She requested them, said she preferred it. Mrs. Tierney paused, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read his moods. "Is there a problem?" "No," Callum said. "No problem." He turned to leave, then stopped. "She's pregnant." "Yes, and she's working overnight shifts, on her feet, carrying heavy supplies." Mrs. Tierney hesitated. She said she could handle it. She was quite insistent, actually. I got the impression she needed these hours. Callum looked at her steadily. "Move her to day shifts, light duties only. Nothing that requires lifting, bending, or being on her feet for more than 30 minutes at a time. If she resists, tell her it's policy." Mrs. Tierney nodded slowly, the way people did when they sensed the conversation was not a request. The next evening, Callum made a point of being in the East Wing library at a time when the day crew would be rotating through. He sat in one of the leather chairs near the window, pretending to read a file, and waited. The library was his favorite room in the house, floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with books he had actually read, a fireplace that threw warm light across the Persian rug, and windows that looked out over the garden. It was the one room in the estate that felt like it belonged to a person, rather than a reputation. She came in just after 4 o'clock. She carried a cloth and a spray bottle and moved to the bookshelves along the far wall without looking at him. Her movements were slow and deliberate. The belly made everything harder. She stretched carefully, bracing one hand against the shelf for balance, her jaw tight with the effort of reaching. "Nola," he said. She didn't turn around. "Nola Ferris." Her hand stopped moving. She stood still for a long time, her back to him. He could see her breathing change, the rise and fall of her shoulders quickening, then slowing, as if she were forcing herself back under control. "It's just Nola," she said quietly. "And I go by a different name now. Sit down. I'm working. Sit down, please." She turned then. Her face was thinner than he remembered. The softness of childhood had been replaced by something angular and guarded. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of sleep would fix. The kind of shadows that come from months, maybe years, of sleeping lightly and waking afraid. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they once trusted, but no longer believe they can afford to. She sat on the edge of the chair across from him, her hands folded over her belly. She didn't lean back. She sat like someone ready to stand, again, at any moment. "How long have you known it was me?" She asked. "Since last night. I didn't think you'd recognize me." "I recognize the scar." Her hand moved involuntarily to her eyebrow. She caught herself and lowered it. "You disappeared," Callum said. 17 years ago. One day you were on the block. The next day your apartment was empty. Nobody knew where you went. Your neighbors said a van came in the middle of the night, and your mother loaded everything she could carry. My mother moved us to Bridgeport. She had family there. Nola's voice was flat, careful. It wasn't planned. It just happened fast. "You could have found me. You were 15. I was 14. We were kids, Callum. I looked for you." She glanced up. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or grief. And then it was gone. "You shouldn't have," she said. He leaned forward. "Who put those bruises on your wrists?" She stood up immediately. "I need to finish the shelves." "Nola, it's nothing. I bruise easily. It's a pregnancy thing." She picked up the spray bottle and turned her back to him again. Callum watched her hands. They were trembling. The spray bottle shook in her grip, and she pressed it against her hip to stare at it. He didn't push, not yet, but the question didn't leave him. It sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable. Over the next few days, he paid attention. He watched the way Nola moved through the house, always along the edges of rooms, always with her head slightly lowered, always aware of who was nearby. She flinched when doors closed too loudly. She startled at raised voices, even when they were coming from a television in another room. She never ate in the staff dining room. She took her meals alone in the service hallway, standing up, as if she needed to be ready to leave at any moment. He noticed other things too. She wore long sleeves, even when the house was warm. She kept her phone, an old prepaid model with a cracked screen, in her pocket at all times and checked it compulsively, not like someone waiting for a message, but like someone watching for a threat. She never spoke about herself. The other staff members knew nothing about her, where she was from, whether she had family, who the father of the baby was. She was polite, efficient, and completely invisible by design. On Thursday, he overheard something that made his jaw tighten. One of the senior housekeepers, a woman named Poole, had cornered Nola in the laundry corridor. Callum was passing through the adjacent hallway and heard the voice through the open service door. "You're not here to rest, sweetheart. I don't care how far along you are. If you can't keep up, we'll find someone who can. There are 40 women at the agency who would kill for your spot." "I'm keeping up." Nola's voice was barely above a whisper. "You missed 2 baseboards in the South Hall. That's not keeping up. That's dead weight. And I'll tell you something else. Being pregnant doesn't give you special treatment. Not here, not anywhere. I'll go back and redo them. You'll do them right the first time or you'll be gone by Friday." Callum stepped through the doorway. Poole turned, her face drained of color. She straightened immediately, her hands dropping to her sides. "Mrs. Poole," Callum said, his voice perfectly even. "Step into my office in 10 minutes. He looked at Nola. She was staring at the floor, her hands gripping the edge of the folding table. Her knuckles were white. She looked like she was bracing for something, a blow, a dismissal, some new punishment for a crime she hadn't committed. "You're fine," he said to her quietly. "Go sit down somewhere. Get something to eat." Poole was reassigned to a different property by the end of the day. Callum didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. He explained in the same measured tone he used for all consequential conversations that anyone under his roof who mistreated a pregnant woman would not remain under his roof. Poole left with her personal items in a paper bag and a reference letter that was accurate but unenthusiastic. That night, Nola found him in the library again. She stood in the doorway, uncertain, one hand resting on the frame. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did. She was just doing her job." "No, she was doing something else entirely." He closed the book on his lap. "Sit with me for a minute." She hesitated, then came in. She sat in the same chair as before, folding herself into it carefully, one hand resting on the curve of her belly. The firelight caught the exhaustion in her face, the shadows under her cheekbones. "When is the baby due?" he asked. 6 weeks, maybe 7. "Are you seeing a doctor?" She looked away. "I've been to a clinic, twice." "Twice? In how many months?" 7. "You've had 2 prenatal appointments in 7 months. I've been busy. You've been surviving." He corrected her gently. "There's a difference." She didn't argue. She stared at her hands, folded in her lap. The silence between them stretched. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms between 2 people who once knew each other well enough that words were not always necessary. The kind of silence that remembers, even when the people themselves have tried to forget. "Do you remember the fence behind the laundromat?" he asked. She almost smiled. "The one I fell off of?" "You didn't fall. You jumped. You were trying to get to the other side because Eddie Salcedo had my backpack and was throwing it over." "Eddie Salcedo." She shook her head. "I haven't thought about him in years." "You cleared the fence and landed on your face. Blood everywhere. I thought you'd split your whole forehead open, and you still got the backpack. And you cried." "I did not cry." "You absolutely cried. You thought I was dying. You were holding my hand and telling me to stay. Awake like I was in a war movie. I was concerned. You were sobbing." Despite herself, she laughed. It was small and brief, but it was real. The sound of it changed the room. He leaned back. "You were the only person on that block who ever stood up for me." "Not once." Over and over. Every time Eddie or those guys had something to say about my clothes, or my shoes, or my mother, every time someone pushed me on the way home from school. You were always there. This scrawny kid with the ponytail and the backpack that was bigger than she was, stepping in front of kids twice her size. Somebody had to. No, nobody had to. That's the point. Nobody had to, and you did it anyway. Her eyes glistened. She blinked it away quickly. The way she did everything, fast, controlled, as if showing emotion was a weakness she could not afford. "That was a long time ago," she said. "It wasn't that long ago, not to me." She stared at her hands. "Callum, I'm not who I was. A lot has happened. I can see that. And I don't want your pity. You're not getting pity. You're getting honesty." He paused. "Someone hurt you, and you're afraid. I can see it every time you walk into a room. You check the exits. You keep your back to the wall. Your eyes go to the door before they go to the person talking to you. I know what that looks like, Nola. I grew up around it." She pressed her lips together. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away fast, almost angry at herself for letting it fall. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire cracked softly in the grate. The clock ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. "His name is Garrett," she said at last. Her voice was thin, almost clinical. The way people speak when they're trying to narrate their own pain from a distance. "We were together for 2 years. I met him at a restaurant where I was waitressing in Pennsylvania. At first, he was the kindest man I'd ever met. Patient, generous. He remembered everything I said. He asked questions about my day. He made me feel like I was the only person in the room." She paused, her fingers pressed into the arm of the chair. "And then I got pregnant, and he changed." "Changed how?" "Slowly. At first it was little things. He needed to know where I was at all times. Who I talked to. What I ate. What I wore. He checked my phone every night before bed. Went through every text, every call, every search. He said it was because he loved me. Because he was worried about me. Because the world was dangerous, and he needed to know I was safe." She swallowed. "And then it stopped being about my safety. If I said the wrong thing, or looked at him the wrong way, or didn't answer a question fast enough, he'd grab me, push me into a wall. Once he shoved me into the bathroom counter hard enough that I couldn't stand up for 10 minutes. I had a bruise on my hip that lasted 6 weeks. Callum's hands were perfectly still on the arms of the chair. His face showed nothing, but inside something had locked into place, something old and patient and very, very cold. The worst part, she said, is that he always apologized. Every time he'd cry, he'd hold me and tell me he was sorry, that it would never happen again, that he'd get help. And I believed him. I believed him every single time because the alternative, that the man whose baby I was carrying was not going to change, was something I couldn't afford to accept. "You left him," Callum said. 5 months ago. I waited until he was out of the house. I took one bag, clothes, my ID, the cash I'd been hiding in a tampon box because he went through everything else. I drove for 9 hours and ended up here. I slept in my car for 2 nights before I found a room at a shelter. I found the agency job listing the next week. Does he know where you are? No. I changed my name. I use a prepaid phone. I don't have social media. I don't contact anyone from before. Not my cousins, not my friends, nobody. Is he looking for you? She was quiet for a long time. The fire hissed softly. Garrett doesn't let things go, she whispered. He told me once, if I ever left, he'd find me. No matter how long it took. He said it was a promise. Callum nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Okay, what? Okay, I heard you. She looked at him with something between fear and confusion. Callum, you can't get involved. He's not... You don't understand what he's like. He's unpredictable. He doesn't care about consequences. I understand exactly what he's like. This isn't your problem. You're right. It's not a problem. Not anymore. He said it simply, the way someone states a fact about the weather or the time of day. There was no bravado in it. No performance. Just a quiet certainty that settled over the room like a change in air pressure. Nola opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since she'd walked into this house. She saw the boy from Hester Street. Older. Harder. Carrying the weight of a world she didn't fully understand. But beneath all of it, the same steady eyes. The same stubborn, unshakable loyalty that had made a 15-year-old kid walk her home every night for 2 years, through a neighborhood where walking alone after dark was a gamble no one won consistently. She didn't say thank you. She couldn't. The word wasn't big enough. She just nodded once, and he nodded back. The next morning, Callum made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Adana Osei, an obstetrician at Lenox Hill, who owed him a considerable favor and whose discretion was absolute. He arranged for Nola to be seen within the week. Full prenatal evaluation, blood work, ultrasound, nutritional assessment, everything. The second call was to a man named Sullivan, who handled the kind of research that didn't appear on any official database and who asked questions only when the answers would affect his methodology. Garrett Hale, Callum said. Probably mid-30s. Likely based in Pennsylvania or the Mid-Atlantic corridor. Domestic violence history, possibly unreported. I need everything. How deep? Bottom of the ocean. Sullivan didn't ask why. He never did. Within 48 hours, the file arrived. It was 34 pages. Callum read it in his office with the door closed and a glass of water he didn't touch. Garrett Hale, 34, born in Allentown, Pennsylvania, employed intermittently, construction, warehouse work, a stint at an auto body shop that ended after a dispute with the owner, 2 prior girlfriends, both of whom had filed protection orders that were later withdrawn. The withdrawals followed a predictable pattern: intense contact, emotional pressure, implied threats, and eventually, the women decided it was safer to drop the orders than to enforce them. There was a DUI conviction from 4 years ago, a dismissed assault charge from 6 years before that, the complainant having declined to testify. A pattern that repeated itself like a broken clock. Violence, remorse, silence, violence again. He had no criminal record serious enough to keep him locked up. That was the sickness of it. The system had touched him and let him go, over and over, the way a net with 2 wide holes lets the most dangerous fish swim right through. There was one more detail in the file. Garrett had made inquiries, through a cousin in New Jersey, about a woman matching Nola's description. The inquiries were recent, within the last 10 days. Callum closed the file. He sat still for a long time, his eyes fixed on the window where the October afternoon was turning the garden gold. Then he picked up the phone and called his head of security. "I want 2 additional people on the property," he said. "Plain clothes. 1 at the east gate. 1 rotating through the interior. I want cameras on every access point. Access. Checked and updated. And I want to know immediately, if anyone unfamiliar approaches within a mile of this house." He didn't tell Nola about the file. Not yet. There was no reason to add fear to what she was already carrying. She had enough weight. She didn't need to know that the man she'd fled was already reaching in her direction. Instead, he focused on the things he could control. He moved her out of the staff quarters and into the guest suite on the second floor. A small but private room with its own bathroom and a window that overlooked the garden. When she protested, he told her it was being used for storage and needed someone in it to justify the heating bill. She didn't believe him, but she was too tired to fight. He had the kitchen prepare meals for her that the house physician recommended for the final trimester. Lean proteins, dark leafy greens, complex carbohydrates, things that would keep her steady and keep the baby healthy. The trays appeared at her door at the same times each day, carried by a kitchen aide named Petra, who had been told not to make a fuss about it, and who followed this instruction by leaving the tray with a quiet knock and a small smile. He quietly adjusted her work schedule so that she had 2 days off per week instead of 1. When she asked about it, Mrs. Tierney said it was a company-wide policy change. Nola looked skeptical, but said nothing. And twice a week in the evenings, they sat in the library. They didn't always talk about important things. Sometimes they talked about the neighborhood, the bodega on the corner of Hester and Eldridge where the old man used to give them broken popsicles for free because he couldn't sell them and he couldn't stand to throw them out. The time Callum's mother caught him trying to cook rice with cold water and no lid and lectured him for 20 minutes about disrespecting grain. The summer the fire hydrant broke open on the block and every kid within 4 streets came running and the water hit the asphalt so hard it bounced 3 feet in the air. And for one afternoon, the whole neighborhood forgot what it was supposed to be worried about. She told him about Bridgeport, how her mother had worked at a packaging facility until her back gave out. How Nola had finished high school by 2 credits and never went back for them. How she'd moved from town to town through her 20s, waitressing, cleaning houses, doing bookkeeping for a plumber's office in Scranton, where the owner called her kid even though she was 28. In those moments, Nola almost looked like herself again. The tension in her shoulders would ease, the guardedness in her eyes would soften. She would laugh, really laugh, and the sound would fill the library like something that had been missing from the room long before she arrived. But then a door would close somewhere in the house, and she would go still. Her hand would move to her belly. The light would leave her face. And the woman who had been sitting there, talking and remembering, would retreat behind the walls she had spent years building. Callum saw it every time, and every time he said nothing. He just stayed in the chair across from her and let the silence hold until she was ready to come back. 3 weeks before the due date, Callum's phone rang at 11 at night. He was in his office, reviewing something that could wait, when Sullivan's name appeared on the screen. "Hale crossed into New York this afternoon," Sullivan said. "He's staying at a motel in Yonkers. He's been making calls, trying to track down the staffing agency she went through." Callum was already on his feet. "The agency? They won't give out employee information without a court order, but he's been calling repeatedly, left threatening voicemails, 4 in the last 2 days, said he was looking for his pregnant wife, used her real name." "What else?" "He's got a buddy in Yonkers, former bouncer, type name of Petrocelli. The 2 of them have been asking around in service industry circles, showing a photo, her old photo, before she changed her appearance. They've been to 3 cleaning companies, 2 restaurants, and a hotel staffing office. Nobody's given him anything, but he's widening the radius." Callum's jaw tightened. "Keep eyes on him, around the clock. I want to know where he eats, where he sleeps, who he talks to. If he moves toward Westchester, I want to know before his car leaves the parking lot." He hung up. He stood in the dark of his office, his hand flat on the desk, thinking. He had spent his entire adult life managing threats, anticipating danger, reading the movements of men who operated outside the boundaries of ordinary society. Garrett Hale was not a sophisticated man. He was fueled by rage and entitlement, a dangerous combination, but a predictable one. Men like Garrett didn't plan. They escalated. They burned hotter and hotter until they did. Something irreversible, and then the system finally noticed, usually too late. Callum had handled far worse, but this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal, in a way that reached back further than anything in his current life. The girl who had jumped a fence and bloodied her face for a kid nobody else cared about. That girl was sleeping 2 floors above him, carrying a child she was terrified she couldn't protect. He would not allow the ending to be written by a man like Garrett Hale. He told Nola the next morning. He owed her that much. He found her in the garden, sitting on the stone bench near the hedgerow. The November air was cold, but she had a blanket over her shoulders and a paperback in her hands, some old novel with a creased spine that she'd found in the staff lounge. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the gravel. He sat beside her on the bench and told her plainly. No softening, no evasion. Garrett was in New York. He was looking for her. Callum's people were watching him. He had not found her, and he would not find her. Nola's face went white. The book slid from her fingers and landed open on the ground. Her hands moved to her belly and pressed there as if she could shield the baby through her own skin. How? Her voice cracked. How did he find out I was in New York? He hasn't found you. He's casting a wide net, that's all. He's looking, but he doesn't know where you are, and he won't. He'll figure it out. He always figures it out. He found my cousin in Baltimore. He showed up at her job and waited in the parking lot for 3 hours. He left a note on her windshield. She moved 2 weeks later. This isn't Baltimore, and he's not dealing with your cousin. She looked at him with raw fear. Callum, you don't understand. He'll hurt someone. He doesn't care about consequences. He doesn't think like a normal person. When he wants something, he just keeps pushing until something breaks. Neither do I. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Callum crouched beside the bench, so his eyes were level with hers. Listen to me. You are safe in this house. You are safe because I say you are safe, and there is not a person in this state or any other who will override that. Do you understand me? She was shaking. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench, knuckles white. I'm scared for the baby, she whispered. I know, and I'm telling you, nothing will happen to this baby. Amud, nothing will happen to you. That's not a hope. That's a fact, she exhaled. It came out ragged, broken, like something that had been held too long, and then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his shoulder, and he felt the full weight of her exhaustion and terror pass through her body like a current. Months of sleepless nights, months of checking over her shoulder, months of carrying a child alone while running from the one person in the world who should have made her feel safe. He didn't move, he didn't speak, he just stayed there, steady and still, the way a wall stays when everything else is shaking. 5 days later, at 4 a.m, Nola woke up to a sharp, twisting pain in her abdomen. She lay in the dark, breathing carefully, one hand pressed flat against the mattress, the other against her belly. She waited for it to pass. It didn't. It came again, harder, and a wave of nausea rose in her throat. Something felt wrong, not the normal discomfort she had grown accustomed to, something deeper, something urgent. She reached for the phone on the nightstand. Her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped it twice before she managed to dial. Callum answered on the first ring. His voice was clear and alert, as if he hadn't been sleeping at all. Something's wrong, she said. I think the baby's coming. He was at her door in under 2 minutes. He took one look at her, pale, sweating, gripping the headboard with both hands, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts, and turned to the security detail in the hallway. Get the car. Now, Lenox Hill. Call Dr. O.C. and tell her we're 25 minutes out. The ride was a blur of city lights and empty late-night streets. Nola sat in the back seat, her breathing shallow and fast, her eyes squeezed shut against the pain. Callum sat beside her. He didn't hold her hand. She hadn't asked, but he kept talking to her in a low, steady voice. He told her about the time his mother made him carry a 40-pound bag of rice up 6 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken and he had complained about being bored. He told her about the pigeon that used to sit on his fire escape every morning and stare at him through the window like it was judging his life choices. He told her about the time Eddie Salcedo tried to steal a candy bar from the bodega and the old man behind the counter chased him 3 blocks with a broom. She almost laughed between contractions. Almost. At the hospital, everything moved fast. Dr. Osei met them in the private wing, already gowned, her calm authority filling the corridor like a steadying hand. Nola was 3 weeks early. The baby was small. There were concerns about blood pressure. Hers had been dangerously elevated, likely for weeks, compounded by the stress and the hours on her feet and the constant, corrosive fear she had been carrying. They prepped her for delivery. Callum stood in the hallway outside the room while nurses moved in and out. He didn't pace, he didn't sit. He just stood with his back against the wall and his arms crossed, watching the door. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and nobody answered. A nurse came out and looked at him. "Are you the father?" "No." "Family?" He paused. The word sat between them, heavier than it should have been. "Yes," he said. "She's asking for you." He went in. The room was bright and clinical and filled with the sound of machines beeping in steady rhythm. Nola was on the bed, her face flushed, her dark hair damp against her forehead. She looked smaller than he had ever seen her. This woman who had once jumped fences and stared down bullies. Reduced by pain and fear to something fragile and fierce at the same time. "I'm scared," she said. "I know. Will you stay?" "I'm not going anywhere." She reached for his hand. He gave it to her. She gripped it with a strength that surprised them both. And he stayed. The baby was born at 7:22 in the morning. A girl, 5 pounds, 4 ounces. She came into the world with a thin, warbling cry that filled the room and seemed to press against the walls, a sound so small and so insistent that it silenced everything else. Nola wept. Not the quiet, restrained tears she had been holding back for months. Real, full, breaking open tears, the kind that come when the thing you've been carrying alone is, finally, set down. She cried with her whole body, her shoulders shaking, her hands trembling, and the sound of it was not sadness. It was release. It was the sound of a door opening after being locked for a very long time. The nurse placed the baby on her chest. Nola curled around her daughter like a shelter, her arms forming a cradle, her lips pressed to the top of the baby's head. She whispered something that no one else could hear. Callum stood near the window. He watched them, this woman and this child, and felt something shift inside him that he didn't try to name. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't possessive. It was older than that. It was the recognition that some bonds are not chosen. They are inherited from the people we once were, carried forward through time and silence and distance. And they do not break simply because the world tries to break the people who hold them. This was not his baby. This was not his family in any way the world would recognize. He had no claim to this moment. But he had been there. And he would continue to be there because loyalty, real loyalty, the kind that is built in childhood and tested by time and silence and loss, does not come with conditions. He stepped into the hallway and stood alone for a moment. He pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and coffee. From inside the room, the baby cried again, a small, startled sound, like someone surprised to find herself alive. Then he took out his phone and made a call. "Sullivan, I need you to move on Hale. Today, not tomorrow. Today." What happened next unfolded with the kind of quiet, methodical precision that Callum Brennan was known for, but rarely seen. Sullivan's team had been monitoring Garrett Hale's movements for weeks. They had compiled a record that was far more damning than anything law enforcement had managed to assemble. Threatening voicemails left at the staffing agency, recorded conversations with his associate Petricelli that included explicit descriptions of what he intended to do when he found Nola, a digital trail of harassment, emails sent to Nola's former landlord, calls to her previous employer, messages to her estranged family members demanding information. But the most critical piece was something Garrett Hale had done himself in a moment of impulsive fury 3 days earlier. He had driven to the Bronx and confronted a woman at a bus stop he mistakenly believed was Nola. He had grabbed her arm. She had screamed. 3 witnesses had called the police. Garrett had fled before they arrived, but the incident was on record, and the woman had pressed charges. Callum's attorney, a former federal prosecutor named Whitfield, presented the full body of evidence to the district attorney's office in a private meeting that lasted 40 minutes. The packet included the prior restraining orders from Garrett's former partners, the new assault charge, the threatening voicemails, the recorded conversations, and a sworn statement from Nola detailing 18 months of escalating domestic abuse. An arrest warrant was issued that afternoon. Garrett Hale was picked up at the Yonkers Motel at 6:45 in the evening. He was charged with assault, stalking, criminal harassment, and violation of an emergency protective order that Whitfield had secured on Nola's behalf earlier that day. He did not go quietly. He never would have. But it didn't matter. Callum received the confirmation by text while sitting in the hospital cafeteria, drinking coffee from a paper cup. He read the message, closed his phone, and sat still for a very long time. The cafeteria was nearly empty. A janitor mopped the floor near the vending machines. The overhead lights cast everything in a flat, neutral glow. Then he went back upstairs. Nola was asleep. The baby was in the bassinet beside her, swaddled in a white hospital blanket, her tiny face scrunched in the particular way that newborns have, as if the world is already louder and brighter than expected, and they're not entirely sure they approve. He didn't wake Nola. He sat in the chair by the window and watched the city lights through the glass until morning. When she woke, he told her. She listened without speaking. Her hand rested on the bassinet. Her fingers curled around the edge, as if maintaining contact with the baby even in stillness. When he finished, she stared at the wall for a long time. Then she looked down at her daughter. "She'll never know him," Nola said. "She'll never know what that feels like." "No," Callum said. "She won't." Nola closed her eyes. Something in her face, some tension that had lived there so long it had become part of her features, part of the architecture of who she was, finally began to ease. It didn't disappear. Oh, that kind of weight doesn't vanish overnight, but it shifted, it loosened, it made room for something else. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that healing is quiet, not empty, but deliberate. Nola stayed at the estate while she recovered. Callum had the guest suite furnished properly. A crib, a changing table, a rocking chair that appeared one evening without explanation. When Nola asked where it came from, Mrs. Tierney said she had found it in storage. This was not true, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said anything about it. Nola named the baby Josephine. She didn't explain the name, and Callum didn't ask. Slowly, carefully, Nola began to rebuild the architecture of a life that had been taken apart piece by piece over the course of 2 years. She started with small things. Cooking a meal for herself in the kitchen without asking permission. Walking in the garden with the baby in a sling against her chest. Letting the cold air touch her face without flinching at the sound of footsteps behind her. Reading a book from start to finish without checking the locks on the doors. She began looking into training programs. She had always been good with numbers. Callum remembered that from when they were kids, how she could do math in her head, faster than the teacher could write it on the board, how she kept a running count of everything. Popsicle sticks, bottle caps, the number of steps from the bodega to the fire hydrant. He connected her with a program at a community college that offered coursework in accounting and business management. He covered the tuition. When she protested, he told her to consider it an investment in someone he trusted and that he expected a full return in competence and ambition. She rolled her eyes. But she enrolled. Callum never asked for anything. He never positioned himself as a savior or a benefactor. He didn't hover. He didn't make decisions for her. He simply made sure that the path in front of her was clear of the obstacles that had nothing to do with her ability and everything to do with the cruelty of one man and the indifference of a world that hadn't noticed. And when she was ready, when the baby was 3 months old and sleeping through the night, and the protective order had been extended, and the case against Garrett was moving toward trial. Nola sat with Callum in the library one evening and said the thing she had been holding back for a long time. "I owe you everything." "You don't owe me anything." "Callum." "Nola." She shook her head. "You don't get to do what you've done and then wave it away like it was nothing." "I'm not waving it away. I'm telling you the truth. What I did wasn't a debt for you to repay. It was the only thing I could have done and still been the person I want to be." She looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled softly. Josephine slept in the bassinet between their chairs, her small fist curled against her cheek. "Do you remember what you said to me once?" Nola asked, "after Eddie Salcedo and those boys cornered you behind the basketball court? You were sitting on the curb with a split lip, and I was trying to clean it up with a napkin from the bodega. And you said, I said I wished I could be the kind of person people were afraid to mess with. And I told you that was stupid. You told me it was stupid, and that being feared was the loneliest thing in the world." She nodded slowly. "Was I right?" He looked at the fire. The flames moved against the grate in slow, shifting patterns. "You were right about a lot of things. Then listen to me now. What you've become, the power, the empire, all of it, none of it is what makes you worth knowing. The thing that makes you worth knowing is the same thing that made you worth knowing when you were 12 years old, and too skinny, and wearing shoes with holes in them. You're loyal to the people you love. That's it. That's the whole thing." He didn't respond right away. The room was warm and quiet and full of the sound of the baby breathing. "Josephine is going to need people like that in her life," Nola said quietly. "People who show up. People who stay." He looked at her. "I'll be there," he said, and she believed him, not because of his money, not because of his name, not because of the reach and the reputation and the silent authority that followed him into every room. She believed him because she had known him when he was nothing, and he had been exactly the same. 6 months later, Nola moved into her own apartment. It was a 2-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood in White Plains, far enough from the city to feel safe, close enough to commute to her classes. Callum had offered to help with the deposit. She had accepted, but only as a loan, documented with a repayment schedule she had drawn up herself, in a spreadsheet with color-coded categories and interest calculations. He had signed it without reading it. She had made him read it. Josephine was crawling by then. She had her mother's dark eyes and a disposition that could only be described as fiercely opinionated. She screamed when she didn't want to be held, and screamed louder when she wasn't held fast enough. She had a particular attachment to a stuffed rabbit that Mrs. Tierney had bought from a shop in the village, and she would not sleep without it pressed against her face. Callum visited on Sundays. He brought groceries. He assembled furniture with the focused incompetence of a man whose skill set did not include Allen wrenches. He sat on the living room floor while Josephine crawled across his lap and grabbed fistfuls of his shirt, and he didn't flinch, even when she drooled on the Italian cotton. The trial came and went. Garrett Hale was convicted on multiple charges. The judge cited the pattern of abuse, the interstate stalking, the threatening communications, and the assault on the woman in the Bronx. He was sentenced to 8 years. Nola attended the sentencing via closed-circuit video from the district attorney's office. She watched the verdict with dry eyes and steady hands. When it was over, she turned off the screen and went to pick up Josephine from daycare. That night, she called Callum. "It's done," she said. "I heard. I don't feel relieved. I thought I would. I just feel tired." "That's normal. Relief comes later, sometimes much later." "How do you know?" "Because I've watched a lot of people survive the thing they thought would break them, and the ending never feels the way they expected." She was quiet for a moment. "What does it feel like when it finally comes?" "It feels like Tuesday. It feels like waking up one morning and realizing you're making coffee because you want it, not because you need it to keep going. It feels ordinary, and that's how you know it's real." She smiled. He couldn't see it through the phone, but he heard it in the silence. The particular quality of stillness that comes when something hard settles into something soft. "Good night, Callum." "Good night, Nola." Time passed, the way it always does, unevenly, stubbornly, and with a strange tendency to heal things you didn't realize were broken. Nola finished her coursework. She graduated with honors, a detail she mentioned offhandedly, and that Callum discovered only because Mrs. Tierney, who had been invited to the ceremony, told him afterward. She took a position at a small financial advisory firm in White Plains, entry-level, long hours, modest pay. She was good at it. Within a year, she was managing a client portfolio. Within 2, she had been promoted twice. Josephine grew. She walked, she talked, she developed a fierce independence that reminded Callum, sometimes painfully, of her mother at that age, unwilling to back down, unafraid to speak, and deeply suspicious of anyone who tried to carry her when she wanted to walk. Callum continued to visit on Sundays. The grocery runs evolved into dinners. The dinners evolved into a standing tradition. Nola cooked. Callum cleaned. Josephine sat in her high chair and threw pasta at the wall with the focus and precision of a small, determined artist. They didn't talk about the past very often. They didn't need to. The past was the foundation, not the house. The house was something they were building now, slowly, carefully, without blueprints or expectations. One evening, as Callum was leaving, Josephine ran to the door and wrapped her arms around his leg. "Stay," she said. She was 2.5. The word came out more like a command than a request. He looked down at her. Then he looked at Nola, who stood in the hallway with a dish towel over her shoulder and an expression on her face that she wasn't trying to hide. "I'll be back Sunday," he said to Josephine. He crouched down and let her grab his face with both hands. She inspected him seriously, turning his head left and right, then nodded, apparently satisfied with the terms. He stood up. Nola walked him to the door. "She likes you," Nola said. "She has good taste." Nola laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it filled the narrow hallway of the small apartment in White Plains, the way laughter fills a room when it has been missing for a very long time. Callum walked to his car. The night air was cold. The street lights threw long shadows across the pavement. A dog barked somewhere on the next block. An airplane moved across the sky, its lights blinking slowly, carrying people to places they needed to be. He sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about the girl on Hester Street who had jumped a fence and bled for a kid nobody else cared about. He thought about the woman in the gray uniform who had walked into his house carrying cleaning supplies and carrying something much heavier, the accumulated weight of years of fear, silence, and survival. He thought about the child asleep inside the apartment, the child who was not his by blood, not his by any measure the world would recognize, but who had grabbed his face with both hands and told him to stay. He started the car. He drove home through the dark, quiet streets. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like peace.